Good morning.
Morning.
How's everybody? I want to welcome you to ADG, all of you who are all know each other. And I see some names on the list here that people we haven't seen in a long time. So welcome back for those of you who are online. Today, as most of you know, I think we have Professor Rick Bell, who's a professor of history at the University of Maryland. And the topic is going to be on the, actually from his book called Stolen. That book right there. Yeah, I'll pass the book on. And it's going to be a story about the reverse underground railroad, which some of you, I'd never heard of it before. I first met Rick, sort of. Rosie was taking a UCLA online class last summer with him on the American Revolution and slavery. And I was kind of lurking in the background and began to listen to it a little bit and got so fascinated with it that I got in touch with him and he spoke at a book group that I was in also. Anyway, Rick is a professor of history. He's from Britain. Spent his undergraduate years at the UK, came here and got his PhD in Harvard in US history, and now teaches at Maryland. One of the interesting things he said, one of the times I've heard him, is that he wrote this book because he got tired of writing to boring books to historians. So this is a really kind of a mass, not a mass market, but a book for the general public, written by a historian, and it shows all the research that a historian can do on events that took place in the early 1800s. So, sorry. Yeah, I would suggest that everyone also to turn off your mic. Rick would like to talk for about 35 or 45 minutes, and then he'll open it up for questions and answers. So without any more, Rick, welcome to the Adult Discussion Group. Thanks for coming.
All right. Thank you for that, Rich. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor, actually, to be with all of you this morning in this unusual hybrid format where I can see some of you logging in from home. Hello to all of you. And I can see a room full of people. Hello to all of you as well. I'm looking at you right now. Yes, thank you for waving back. I appreciate it. I can see you. This is real. So I'm very far away from you. I got to tell you, I wish I was on the West Coast this morning. It's pretty miserable out here on the East Coast. I live in suburban Maryland near Washington, DC. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to is I'm coming to the West Coast a few times in the fall for research at the Huntington Library in San Marino, just near Pasadena. So I'm really looking forward to be back in the LA area. But until then, we are on Zoom together. So as Rich said, I'm Rick Bell. I'm a professor of history at the University of Maryland. Despite this British accent, I focus on American history, especially the period between the Revolution and the Civil War. And I'm very grateful for this invitation to talk with you over the next hour or so about the last 10 years of my research life and the book that was recently published, which contains some findings. It's pretty sobering stuff, as you'll see when I put the title up in a second here. 3, 2, 1. I've called this talk Stolen: Kidnapping and Slavery in Pre-Civil War America. I'm going to share these findings and this research with you for about 40 minutes or so, and then I really look forward to some questions or comments from those of you either watching on Zoom or those of you in the room. That for me is always the most interesting part of talking about this, to hear what your questions and comments are. All right, I'm going to proceed accordingly. Hopefully all of you can see me and hear me, and more importantly, see my slides. So let's get going. I want to begin by telling you about Cornelius Sinclair. Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old, and Cornelius was trapped. Cornelius was stuck, locked in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like this one, that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's market an hour ago, shoved a gag into his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him here. And it was dark below the ship's waterline, but Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down here. 4 pairs of eyes stared right back at him, 4 other African-American boys. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was shorter and smaller than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were enslaved. They were prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far from home. He would probably never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August 1825, and he was one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, Philadelphia was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Its gridded streets, its tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free Black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. And they did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time, not only as the city of brotherly love, but as a safe haven for people of color and as the headquarters of the American anti-slavery movement at the time. But of course, to criminals, to kidnappers, none of that mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and Black anywhere in the United States. And this was a product of its location. Philadelphia was the nearest major free soil city on the East Coast to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to the south, including Maryland, where I'm sitting right now. As Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 years after the American Revolution, that boundary along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for Black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, the Mason-Dixon line seemed to divide 2 worlds, separating northern free soil states from the southern slave states. And Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made Philadelphia's many free Black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby slave states. And they would prey on the members of the city's free Black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. And the people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, 3 of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton. They would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Buying a small percentage of their forced laborers from kidnappers of free Black Americans was not likely their first choice, but their options were limited. Planters down there in the Deep South have been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808. That was the year that lawmakers in Washington had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of Black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them in the United States. That 1808 decision's not very famous, but it was very important. By cutting off international supply of people from the international slave trade, this 1808 decision was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America, because it spurred the growth of an American slave trade, an internal slave trade, a domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the United States tried to satisfy these Southwestern settlers' demands for Black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia, where there were planters who had more than they needed and were willing to sell some. That was legal, of course, and it was big business. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more than that. And the stronger the demand, the more tempting, the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children like Cornelius Sinclair from northern cities like Philadelphia, launder them into that legal supply chain in the South, and then sell them as slaves in this vast new Southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free Black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of a nationwide kidnapping operation. It had become the largest northern depot of something I call America's reverse underground railroad. And so when I use that phrase this morning, America's reverse underground railroad, I'm describing what I just described, which is the kidnapping of free Black Americans, usually from northern towns and cities, for the purpose of enslaving them further south. This reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they ran in opposite directions, right? And they existed for completely different purposes. But because they're opposites, they're also mirror images of each other. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one. On the Underground Railroad, enslaved people abandoned southern plantations and trekked usually northward, dreaming of new lives, new opportunities in freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free Black people were stolen from northern cities like Philadelphia and were made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their lives and their own liberty to help Black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, the conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated solely by money. These two networks, one obviously heroic and courageous, the other monstrously evil, roared to life at the same time in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North versus the South. Both networks were loosely organized and opportunistic. Both ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants, forged documents, false identities and disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and by victims of kidnapping made to go south, the routes were largely the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on each of these two metaphorical railroads was roughly the same. Each year, each one carried hundreds of Black adults and children across state lines, half towards freedom, half towards slavery. Most of us in America know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad by now. Historians have spent decades studying the strategies and the tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. Their achievements finally command our attention. There are Underground Railroad walking tours and television shows and museums, and there's a movie and a TV show too. All of them dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. But I would wager most of us know far less about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even now, even today. Kidnappers never gave public lectures about their work. They never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names and their crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, protected by too much indifference and apathy among ordinary white Americans who knew what they were doing and did nothing to stop it. The outlaws who built America's reverse Underground Railroad left no business records, no bundles of private letters in the Library of Congress for historians like me to read and examine. These kidnappers didn't write memoirs. They didn't pose for paintings or photographs, which left journalists and activists at the time to guess, as you see here, as to what they might have looked like. No one posed for this. But despite all that invisibility, as I argue in my recent book, which I'm sure you can find in your local library, Stolen, these professional kidnappers left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in this book begins, but about every northern town or city with a free Black population. If we think not just about 1825, when this true story begins, but about each and every year between about 1808 and about the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free Black people from northern towns and cities, many of them children like Cornelius who were under the age of 16. And let me be clear here, most of those they kidnapped didn't come home. They were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched frantically for them. They lobbied, they petitioned, they advertised, they waited in earnest for news. Usually nothing came back. No one came back. Free Black people in northern cities like Philadelphia had very few white allies. in this period of American history, beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants. City constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white on black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates or policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants or search property or interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews knew exactly what to do, exactly what to say, to talk their way out of trouble and to get back to work. I'm guessing all of you out there, both in Zoom land and in the room, have heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll probably remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir that was written by a guy named Solomon Northup. And he was, of course, one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, however, Northup later escaped his enslavement. It took him 12 years to do it, but he did it, and then he returned home, and then he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he wrote in 1853, Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed white con men lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Northup was a well-educated, prosperous, literate musician in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, the con men wined him and dined him. And if you remember the movie, you know they drugged him too. And then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northup was soon forced onto a slave ship that was bound for New Orleans. And there he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his cane fields. 9 years ago in 2013, that Oscar-winning film, 12 Years a Slave, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue public attention to Northup's ordeal. But both the memoir and the movie offer misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. It turns out, folks, that Northup's experiences on America's reverse Underground Railroad were not at all typical of everyone else's. Its kidnappers actually rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. No, they preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with tricks that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on their own 2 feet in small, specialized overland walking convoys known as coffles. And their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. Their prisoners were vastly more likely to be sold off along the way in ones or twos, in furtive all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more slaves but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in my book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them aboard a ship just outside Philadelphia, which is in the top right of this map. Their captors warehoused them for a while, a couple of weeks, in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line. If you can see the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen, the black dot is where the safe house was. And then they marched them, one footstep at a time, halfway across this vast continent toward the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 free children as slaves. This, of course, was a soul-destroying journey. One step at a time, it's a journey of 2 million human steps. I have a lot to say about it in the book. In the interest of time this morning, I'm going to pass over the details of the journey itself. And likewise, my publisher continues to insist that I pass over much of this book's extraordinary second half, in which we learn that some, but not all, of these 5 boys make a miraculous, unprecedented escape and begin the astonishing odyssey home to Philadelphia, referred to in the book's subtitle. All I will say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen next was indeed astonishing to them and to me. It would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the grave, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. So instead of breaking my promise to my publisher, telling you everything that happens in the book, if you want to find out, go check out the library. Let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next has never before been told, and for understandable reasons. Cornelius was a child at the time. He came from a hard-up family that was not the sort to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that's a problem, right? Because this is a true story. It's history. And historians need sources, lots of them, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are fair and true. The stories and the struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers, diaries, or memoirs often remain untold and unstudied as a result of the lack of readily available sources. So what do you do? Well, all I can tell you is what I did in this case. To reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse underground railroad, I began with the easy stuff. I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from the mayor of Philadelphia, a man who belatedly wades into this story almost too late. And I turned first to coverage of Cornelius's disappearance in a single anti-slavery magazine. To be clear, historians have known about these modest sources, the letters and the magazine, for some time, but on their own, they turn out to be too few, too thin, to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing odyssey into and out of American slavery. So I had to keep going, and I had to go looking elsewhere, digging around in literally any archive I could think of, including, by the way, the Huntington Library in California, for scraps of information that when put together could help flesh all this out. And along the way, there's been lots of days spent finding nothing useful at all, looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only hay. If you've done your own historical or genealogical research, I bet that sensation is familiar to you. But you should keep at it. Ultimately, it's certainly been worth it in my case. Over 6 years of research for this book, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles buried deep in those haystacks. New sources about this case, buried within 35 archives in 14 states and the District of Columbia. The good news is I'm not going to list all those sources for you here. I will just highlight 3 of them real quick. One of the things I was able to find was the handwritten notes from a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial which would decide the fate of one of these 5 boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered something I thought couldn't exist, couldn't be real. I discovered a pair of letters authored by one of the kidnappers in which he names his accomplices and describes their roles in this particular kidnapping. Such an amazing source. I even reprinted it in the back of the book so you could read it for yourself. But most affectingly of all, at least for me, was this: a missing persons ad printed in a local newspaper right after Cornelius's disappearance and put there by his father, Joseph. It's short, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, "Boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy, about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, it's feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair." As you can imagine, folks, I have read this ad hundreds of times in my life since first discovering it in 2013. Every single time I read this ad, the same 2 words jump out at me, like they're written in neon, like they're written 60 foot high. 2 words: afflicted parents, afflicted parents. All of us are children of parents. Some of us are parents of children or grandchildren. I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old playing on the street in front of my house at this moment, The thought that my children could be snatched away from me and there'd be nothing I could do to get them back, that just rips at me in a really fundamental human way. Afflicted parents. I think that's the understatement of the 19th century. So remember, I want to seek your questions and comments, which I'll do in a few minutes. So start to think some up. But before we get there, please let me wrap up with a couple of short reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free American children ripped from their American families and swallowed up by American slavery is worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities. And Black freedom was achingly fragile. The story demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over this period. Now, as I said, I'm not going to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half. I can't tell you here exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. The publisher wants you to read the book. But I will drop a few big hints. And I will say here that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save him and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies, and the aftermath of their campaign, would radicalize Black communities across the free soil states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well. They would encourage white abolitionists, like the 2 white women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet, to focus the Northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families being forcibly separated by kidnappers, by slave catchers, by slave traders, by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. This 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage Southerners and slaveholders more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. And it would set in motion a chain of court challenges to it and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this country on a collision course with civil war. To conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him, and the things that he and the other 4 boys made happen next, would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that important, lasting legacy must never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. In 1825, a 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. All right, I'm going to pause right there. trust me, this is not a hard sell. If you'd like to find this book, it's probably in your library. If you'd like to own a copy and you'd like me to sign it, then please send me an email. I'd be happy to sell you one, but you should be able to find this in all your local libraries. With that, I'm going to see if we can stir some comments and questions about this topic and related topics in American history. It doesn't have to be narrowly focused, our discussion. So if you're on Zoom and you want to raise your virtual hand or unmute and start talking as a way to get my attention, that's terrific. If you're in the room, maybe you'd start waving frantically or get Rich's attention so that we can make sure I hear your question and respond to it. We have lots of questions. So let's get some questions going.
Rich, I've got to leave for choir. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, there are some of us that have to leave, not us, but a few choir members that have to leave early, so we're going to give them the chance to give their questions if they have.
My question is, was it illegal for a slave in the South to flee? Is that illegal?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the question as I heard it was it illegal for an enslaved person in the South to run away? And the answer is absolutely yes.
So could these people in the North be considered bounty hunters and legal?
Right, so let's get into that in a bit more detail here, because the headline is that the United States Constitution, passed in 1787, guarantees the rights of slaveholders. And it says, among many other things, that if an enslaved person runs away from their legal owner, it doesn't matter where in the United States they go, it doesn't matter what the local laws are in the state they might flee to, they are still a slave, they are still a criminal for running away, a wanted man, a wanted woman, a fugitive, and it is well within the rights of any slaveholder to follow them into any state, no matter how far from their point of origin, and drag them back into slavery. So you've all heard stories of slave catchers pursuing specific runaway enslaved people. You've all heard of slave owners chasing their fugitive property across the country. And there are also professional bounty hunters who grab anyone Black who they think might be a runaway slave. Now, to be clear, the boys in my story, only one of them is actually a runaway slave. That's a guy called Sam. The other four are legally free. They have their freedom papers. They are not fugitives from slavery, but kidnappers see an opportunity here to hide behind the petticoats of the legal protections offered to slave catchers, slave hunters, and slave owners. Kidnappers desperately want to be mistaken for slave catchers grabbing runaways, where in fact, they're grabbing legally free people, treating them like runaways, and dragging them into slavery and selling them. So there are extraordinarily strong legal protections for slave owners and slave catchers, and kidnappers benefit indirectly from those strong protections. I hope I answered your question as I heard it. If I didn't,
yeah, and then does that mean that they could use that strategy as a defense if they did get caught? That they could say, "Oh, gee, my mistake. I thought he was a runaway." Was that their defense if they did?
Yes, yes, that is their defense, right? They claim ignorance about the person's legal freedom, even though they've often literally torn up the person's freedom papers in front of them. But remember, a couple of things. Number one, that in many states, Black people can't give testimony against white people. So it's often difficult for Black people to ever get their day in court and say, I'm not a runaway, I was freeborn, right? This guy tore up my papers in front of him. It's often very hard for Black people to get their day in court in the first place. And then the second thing is, while my book takes place in 1825, at the end of my talk, I referenced something that happened in 1850 called the Fugitive Slave Act. And I described it as a pro-slavery law. Let me tell you one thing the Fugitive Slave Act does. The Fugitive Slave Act beefs up the protections and guarantees in federal law for slaveholders and their emissaries like slave catchers. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 says that it's going to set up little local courts. They're called federal commissions. in every northern town and city, so that if a slave catcher comes to, let's say, Boston, and grabs a black person off the street, he can quickly go to that federal commission to get a stamp of approval to take that person down to South Carolina or Mississippi. And at these federal commissions, local officials are charged with determining whether the black person who's been grabbed is actually a runaway slave who must be sent back into slavery, or whether the black person being grabbed is a legally free person who should be released. Now, that all sounds like a good innovation. However, here's where moral hazard comes in. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 will pay those local magistrates, those local commissioners, $10 each time they determine that the black person brought in front of them by a slave catcher is a runaway slave who must be sent south. They'll be paid $10. And those commissioners will be paid only $5 if they determine that the black person in front of them is legally free and should be released. That, folks, is called moral hazard, and it means that those commissioners will increasingly, disproportionately, in ways that are completely statistically unlikely, find that almost everyone brought before them is definitely a runaway slave who should definitely be returned to slavery, and that they're definitely not free people who've just been grabbed by kidnappers who are pretending to be slave catchers. So this is a huge setback for the campaign against the kidnapping of free black people, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Hope that makes sense.
Is it legal for a slave? Oh, louder? Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, is it legal for a slave owner to kill or hurt a slave?
Good question. So the question as I heard it was, is it legal for a slave owner to kill or hurt a slave? So laws vary by state, and before the revolution, they vary by colony. So I'm talking in very general terms here. The laws are different in Mississippi than they are in Virginia. They're different in Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. And remember, before the revolution, there is slavery in every single American colony. Before the American Revolution, there's not just slavery in Virginia and South Carolina, there's also slavery in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New York. So before the revolution, it's everywhere. After the revolution, it becomes increasingly limited to the South. Anyway, where slavery is legal, masters, slave owners, I call them enslavers, they have a lot of legal rights, and they can inflict corporal physical punishment on their enslaved property without ever being prosecuted or charged with assault or battery. So that is all very legal. The one thing that isn't legal is killing your enslaved property. Most colonial legislatures, most southern states draw the line at killing. And that makes sense, of course. Bear in mind, of course, that even though slavery is vicious and bloody and violent, its goal is to extract labor from the people it torments. Its goal is not to murder them, right? Because you're murdering an asset, as they would have seen it. You're throwing money away by killing an enslaved person. So your goal is to get the most work from them without killing them. That's, in fact, the goal of slavery. So it makes sense, in fact, that the legal code reflects that hard line. You can beat an enslaved person all you want and you're never going to be tried or prosecuted. But if you kill them, then you may face a fine.
A fine?
A fine, yes. You probably won't do prison time. You probably won't do prison time.
Other questions from the live audience? How about people out there in Zoom land? Anyone?
Anyone out there in Zoom land?
Hello?
Hello.
I have a question.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you.
Hey, how would you determine that someone is free? I mean, if they tear up the papers in front of you, then what sort of evidence would they be able to use to say that this child is a free child?
Mary's just raised one of the most agonizing questions in 19th century history. How does a free Black person prove that they're free? right? So let's just take one step back. You remember I mentioned freedom papers a minute ago. Freedom papers are often generated in local law offices when someone who owns an enslaved person decides to free them, right? And there's paperwork to guarantee that. And that paperwork, the enslaver keeps a copy of that transaction. The now free Black person keeps a copy too. And that piece of paper, Mary, your freedom papers, become the most important shred of paper you own, right? And we know that enslaved people who got freedom papers and become legally free take exceptionally good care of these very precious documents. At the National Museum for African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the new one, you can see a tiny little metal canister about the size of this pen, which one Black person hung around their neck on a lanyard, and of course rolled up into it was their freedom papers, right? And it was their desperate hope that it kept it safe and watertight every day. By the way, they had to keep them on their person for exactly the reasons Mary's hinting at, right? Because many Southern states, at least, had laws on the books saying any free Black person out without their freedom papers can be taken as a runaway slave and re-enslaved, right? You don't have your freedom papers, you must be a runaway, is the very perverse logic of this. So what happens, Mary, when some a-hole tears up your freedom papers, right in front of you, tosses them away, or other or they get water damaged, or you leave them at home, it does make you vulnerable. So if you can't produce written proof right there that you are a free person, then suddenly your world gets very dangerous very, very quickly. What was I going to say? There's one more thing I was going to, I know what the other thing I was going to say was. So if you are kidnapped and taken into the South and you're protesting all the time that you're free, how are you going to get out of that? There are laws on the books in most Southern states saying that kidnapping free Black people is actually illegal, and that anyone who says they're a victim of kidnapping should be given their day in court. So on paper, Mary, it looks like the Southern courts are going to protect you. In practice, as you might imagine, it's very hard for victims of kidnapping to know what Southern laws are, to be able to get to a courthouse, find a judge that wants to take the case, find a lawyer who's willing to work for no money, so that you can actually get your day in court. And when you get to court under these very unlikely circumstances, most people don't get to court. But when you do, if you don't have a piece of paper, how do you prove to the judge that you're free? You can't just tell him you're free and hope he'll believe you. Or every enslaved person in America would say, I'm definitely free, release me now, right? So Southern courts have additional requirements to prove a person's freedom. They need credible white witnesses who knew you when you were free. So let's say you are Cornelius Sinclair, this 10-year-old kid from Philadelphia, African-American, and you're kidnapped, and somehow you get your day in court in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Who's going to come down from Philadelphia to testify that he or she knew you when you were free back in Philadelphia? That witness has to be white. That witness has to know you're stuck down there. That witness has to be willing to travel for about 6 weeks, has to be willing to incur travel expenses of hundreds of dollars. The likelihood that credible white witnesses who knew you when you were free are going to go down there and be there when you need them are infinitesimally small. And so even though there are laws on the books seeming to protect free Black Americans who are victims of kidnapping, in practice, there are still very high obstacles to regaining your freedom after it's been taken away from you, which is why stories like the one I tell in Stolen, when some of these boys do regain their freedom, are so vanishingly rare. This is the exception that proves the general rule there. Thank you for the great question, Mary. Arita, do you have a comment or a question? Nope. Who else does? Comment or questions?
There's one in the room itself.
Right here. The second half of your book, has there been a movie offer yet?
So you guys are out in Hollywood, right? So next time,
Yes.
next time you see Oprah, just give her a copy and bill me later. No, in all seriousness, I do think it's my hope, of course, and I'm very biased, that this story reaches as many people as possible, whether it's the book, whether it's the audio book, whether it's the the Kindle version, whatever it might be. And there is a screenwriter who is out in your neck of the woods, who is working on a screenplay for this, and he's pitching it to directors and producers. That's all the news I have. I don't have a big announcement for you, but there is interest in this, and I hope so, because we need to see these stories on screen. Hollywood has a long track record of underestimating the American public's interest in serious stories about the American past, especially African American stories. The great success of 12 Years a Slave is proof of that appetite and interest. We all get smarter when we learn about hard histories that have shaped this country over the past 2.5 centuries. So I hope people will continue to show interest in this story. But yes, a good word in Oprah's ear would really help.
I've got a question. Rick, would the story in your book be on a don't read list of people who were really opposed to having anything about blacks and black history in the public schools and the universities?
I hope so, Rich. I hope so. Given how broad that anti-truth movement has been, I mean, you've all seen lists of these books, right? 850 titles that some Texas congressman wants banned from libraries in his school district or state, is so incredibly broad, like, books like To Kill a Mockingbird, for God's sake. So I would hope to be in the excellent company of American classics like that at some point. This book pulls no punches. I think Rich has read it, right? There's a lot of agony. There's a lot of trauma and tragedy in this book. I'm not remotely interested in sugarcoating this for readers. If you want a happy, clappy story, then this is not it, but it's also a true story, a documented story that reveals.
It's very hard to read sometimes.
It's supposed to be, right? It was incredibly hard. Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, Rich, right? If you don't find this hard to read, then what the hell's wrong with you, right? But we need to confront difficult stories, right? History is not therapy. Anything worth learning, chances are it's going to be discomforting, right? Education should not be infantilizing. We should tell the truth, and we should look hard in the mirror, and then we'll all be better citizens, better equipped to make this country work for everyone, the more we know about the journey we've all been on these last 200 years. So yes, if other books like this deserve to be banned, then hopefully mine does too.
I have a question.
Rosie.
I have two questions. One is the free blacks in Philadelphia, were generally they former slaves, or were there ever some people who were free from the time they got here?
Let me stop there because I can't do two questions at once. So let me answer that first one, and then you can ask me another one. So great question, first of all. The free black population of Philadelphia is, by the standards of the day, very large. Remember, the US population is much, much smaller back then. But in Philadelphia, there are 12,000 free black people. No other city has a larger free black population in the 1820s. Baltimore is next, but everything else is smaller than that. So 12,000 is a big number. Those 12,000 folks, men, women, and children, generally fall into three categories. Let's say a third, but I'm generalizing here. A third are runaways from Southern slavery who come to Philadelphia because it's a free soil city by the 1820s, and they want to be mistaken for being a legally free person, like all their black neighbors, right? So a group of them are runaways. Another group have been born into slavery, but were freed by their enslaver at some point in their lives. After the American Revolution, some enslavers chose to free some of their slaves. Very few founding fathers did that, by the way, but some other enslavers did. Okay, so that's called manumission, and that's what generates freedom papers, as I discussed previously. And then the third category is you can be born into slavery, and then the laws can change in your state as you get older, and you can become free. Pennsylvania has a law which dates from the year 1780, which says any enslaved person born after 1780 will be free when they reach the age of 28. This is an abolition law. It's a really slow, agonizing abolition law, but it does mean that everyone who's 29 years or older by 1825 who's Black is going to be legally free. So people have been freed by the state, people have been freed by their enslavers, and people have freed themselves are the three major sources of the free Black population. Get a second question?
Were any of the Black people who came here free when they came and were never enslaved?
Yeah, a very small number. So if we go back to the colonial era, if we look at the African descended population in 1775, we would say that the American population is about 2.5 million, and about 500,000, 20% are African descended people. Of those 500,000, the vast majority, maybe 95%, are enslaved on the eve of the American Revolution. Those who are free might have been freed by their enslavers at some point, or they might never have been enslaved at all, and they've come to colonial America as free people. That had happened over the years for various specialized reasons that I'm not going to go into, but they're numerically dominated by the hundreds of thousands of people who've been brought here in chains and their children, of course. Slavery is a hereditary institution. That's one of the things that's so toxic about it. If you're an enslaved woman in the US or the colonial America, if you're an enslaved woman and you give birth to a child, that child is born into slavery. That's how slavery grows and thrives. Immigration, forced migration, is a major driver, but then biological reproduction, enslaved women giving birth to children born into slavery, is the other major driver. It's only really after the revolution that the free Black population starts to really grow for all the reasons I've just described.
I have one question. Do we have time?
Yeah, we got
Does anybody else have a
couple more
question?
minutes.
Yeah, I see Sheila on Zoom. I'm going to go to Sheila on Zoom next. Hi, Sheila. Over to you.
Hi, I think you might be interested in the fact that my husband's family has been doing a lot of research on our enslaved background, or his enslaved background, and his enslaved grandfather, great whatever grandfather, actually escaped slavery, learned to read and write, became a minister, ended up moving to England, and within the last like 5 months, they've discovered this whole family that did not know they had African-American background through all the ancestry stuff in Australia and kind of around the world. So it's been a really interesting journey to kind of follow her all these years, and it's definitely a sort of reverse story of most people, but he's got very well documented preaching in England and was a little bit famous in a sense. So they've just found all this out.
Sheila, that's an awesome story. I hope it means you guys get to visit England or Australia and New Zealand sometime soon when travel opens up.
His cousin has definitely been and has the ability to follow up on a lot of this, and so she's got now books, volumes of documentation. So
And Sheila, the point about documentation is interesting. And I don't know your family's story, but I will just say, in case folks don't know, that the American Revolution, and Rich knows this from a course he took with me, the American Revolution is an important moment in the history of slavery. We know that the British want to win the war against the Patriots, who they think are ungrateful rebels. And one of the ways British commanders on the ground try to win the war is by disrupting American slavery and by promising freedom to any enslaved person whose master is a patriot, who will abandon their master, come and serve with the British. And after Britain wins the war, will guarantee your freedom in British Canada or London or wherever in the British Empire you might want to go. Now, of course, Britain loses the war, but it does try to keep its promises to some of those enslaved people who've run to join the British Army and serve in British uniforms. And Sheila may be interested to know that several thousand runaway slaves end up in London, end up in British Canada and other places, and now are legally free people. So it wouldn't surprise me if your ancestor was part of that revolutionary exodus. Now, I want to quickly pivot here and make one other point. That doesn't mean Britain are the good guys when it comes to fighting slavery. Britain is the country that perfected transatlantic slave trading, that immiserated the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. The British government is not trying to destroy slavery in the revolution. It's just trying to screw the Patriots so it can win the war. So don't let my British accent ever confuse you and make you think that it's a British person telling you how bad America is and how great Britain is. It's all dark stuff when we talk about slavery in the 18th century. Thanks for that, Sheila. I really appreciate it.
This would be a good time to.
thank you for all your research.
This would be a good time to close down, I think.
I have a question.
Oh,
I have a
okay.
question. So just curious, I know this is probably a really stupid question, but what did it mean to be a free Black person? I mean, the Blacks have been free in the United States for since the 1800s, but that doesn't mean that they've had equality or been treated better. And I just wondered what things were like for a free Black person in America back then.
Yeah, Mary, I'll be very brief because I know you guys need to move on to other business. So I would just say that Mary and I could talk all day about these issues. I look forward to meeting you in person, Mary. So one of the things that's very clear from my work here is that to be free and Black before the Civil War is to enjoy only a very fragile freedom, right? Where your literal freedom can be ripped up in front of you and you can be kidnapped. And of course, even though you live in a state like, say, Pennsylvania, where slavery is dead, that does not mean that racism is dead in those places, right? That getting a job, getting access to a school or a church, not being spat at on the street, these are not guarantees if you're a free Black person living north of slavery after the revolution. And as all of you are keenly aware, that hasn't changed that much between then and now. Slavery is now outlawed, race slavery, because of the 13th Amendment. But we know that African-American civil rights are constantly under threat, and that racism or white supremacy are ongoing enemies of full equality and civil rights in this country. So you might hear some resonances in my description of what it's like to be free and Black in Philadelphia in the 1820s and what it's like to be free and Black in the United States in 2022. Take a look at the book if you want to learn more about the subjects Mary's raising here. I know you guys have other important work to do this morning, so I will shut up and just say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this stuff. It's very easy to find my email. There you go. Thank you. If you want to be in touch, find my email address. I'll be happy to talk with you. Rich, thank you for this invitation and enjoy the rest of your session this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Does Rich know he's muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I believe you're going to be teaching a one-day class or a 2-hour class at UCLA, and it's going to be online also, I think, in September. Is that what it is?
Correct. Yeah. Take a look at UCLA Extension if you want to see me again.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.